Hello, John Terrell here. Pull a chair up to the fireside at Chateau Cube, where we discuss life, limited magic, and cube draft. Our guest today is Ben Fleisher, aka Fleischdog. Ben has deep connections in the Cube community, by virtue of serving as a moderator for the MTG Cube subreddit. He had a long stint writing really excellent Cube Card of the Day articles on the subreddit, which introduced me to a great many cool cards that are off the beaten path. Ben is one of the founders of the Cube Brainstorming Discord server. He is an original thinker, unafraid to redesign cards to work for him. I am delighted to welcome Ben Fleisher to Chateau Cube. Today we're welcoming Ben to the podcast, so thanks very much for being here, Ben.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to chat with you. I thought to begin, we might play a game whereby I pick at random a color and then pick at random a CMC, and then maybe we can discuss what our favorite card is of that color in CMC. So how does that sound to you?
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. So let's roll the die here. All right, so black.
Uh-oh. Please don't say 5 draw.
We'll see. Black twos. What's your favorite black two?
Recently, Frogkin Kidnapper. So
Frogkin Kidnapper?
This is one of those mystery pack booster cards. So it's one of the test cards. It's a 2/1 for 1 and a black creature frog rogue. When enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from that hand. You ransom that card. So to ransom a card, you exile it. Its owner may pay 3 mana at any time to return it to their hand.
Huh.
So this passes a lot of tests for me. I found both Brain Maggot and Mesmeric Fiend to be a little underwhelming because the 1 power just made them so they never really mattered. So I was paying 2 mana for this discard spell and this very fragile 1/1. Frogkin is just this 2/1. You don't care if it dies because the card is still ransomed even if your frog, croaks. And it's this high tempo play because if your opponent wants the card back, they're always paying more for the ransom than you paid to ransom the card.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been a huge fan of it lately. If we're going off old classics, I mean it's Dark Confidant personally, but this is the new hotness for me.
Okay, nice. Well, that's cool because as I was glancing over my list here, my choice is Kitesail Freebooter. And so it's sort of funny that we picked very similar cards. I like those hand disruption on a stick cards a lot. I like Mesmeric Fiend and Brain Maggot quite well, but I can totally understand your reservations, and making him a 2/1 does sound way better, and not returning the card when the thing dies sounds better.
Freebooter being able to chip in for damage due to its flying and having that 2 toughness is actually really key because I find the airs in the early game often cluttered by these little 1/1s with flying, your fairy godmothers, your tokens, things like that. Yeah, just having a 1/2 body and being able to wear good equipment and just to be able to keep getting in there, you get to strip a removal spell from your opponent. I love Freebooter as well.
Non-creature, non-land is certainly a drawback.
It's a duress,
but yeah. Right. I play Duress. I'm delighted to play Duress. It's fine.
What I've found lately in my cube is I'm playing both Agonizing Remorse, Distress, and Transgress the Mind, which are all these 1 and a black, and 1 and a black hand destruction spells. And I just love them. I love them to bits.
I can totally see that. Some of them have additional restrictions. How do you feel about that? Like Transgress the Mind, I think, has a casting cost requirement for the thing it hits, and it's expensive, maybe?
It hits CMC 3 or greater. So generally it hits 1 up the curve from where it is, which obviously is a downside. Agonizing Remorse was a godsend by Wizards of the Coast.
Yes, I'm running that one.
If anyone with any power is listening, please print more of these for me. I'll be your friend forever. No, I found even Distress at its restrictive mana cost of black to be a card that I'm very happy to play. So much so that in my Orzhov section, I've started running Castigate, which is just another Distress, except it exiles the card for 1 and a black.
Wow, that's interesting that is a desirable effect even on a gold card.
Yeah, right. I was surprised as well.
You want your Thoughtseizes to hit early, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see that would be difficult potentially to hit a black and a white on time.
Yeah, I find having your removal spells, your hand destruction spells hit early is very good, but even just running it out on like turn 4 along with a 2-drop creature and just ripping apart what's left of their hand feels great. Because often people will sandbag in cube their strongest threats in order to play around removal, and you can't really play around hand destruction, so
Well, that's great. I go pretty deep on hand disruption, but you go even deeper on it. That's awesome to hear.
I think it's a pretty vital part of Black's color identity, and it's one that kind of not being able to run 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Inquisition of Kozilek's, 4 Collective Brutalities really hampers that level of being able to interact with your opponent's hand.
Yeah, that's a key to black aggro is that our hand disruption effects, I think.
Oh, it's like you kept this hand because you have this 3 mana Wrath against me. Well, what if you didn't have it, right?
So, Ben, how would you introduce yourself to cube designers, to Magic players?
I'm Fleischdog. I'm the guy who probably removed your post on the subreddit.
Oh, no.
Or or told some bad joke in a Discord.
It was all well
I
deserved.
It always is. No, I'm so I've been cubing for now, I want to say about 6 or 7 years. And I'm a longtime Magic player, and I'm involved enough with the cube community that my gracious host is allowing me to be on his podcast. And at the same time, I'm far away enough from the cube community that I can only ever pretend to know what I'm talking about.
Oh, well, you're underselling yourself there. And yeah, you're incredibly involved in the community. You're a mod on the subreddit, which is probably the biggest place where people congregate to talk
It's
cube.
that and MTG Salvation. Yeah.
Hmm.
I've never been able to figure out how their forum posting works, so I've never bothered going over there. But we get a few people on the subreddit every once in a while that frequent both, and you get to learn some pretty unique things from the people over there as well, because it's a whole different community.
That's true. It's funny how people silo themselves, even in our little niche, like cube
Mhm.
design. It's not like there's that many of us in the world, but right, there's MTG Salvation, there's the subreddit, there's like the Riptide Lab,
And
there are
then
the,
at least 4 major discords as well. So
right.
yeah, we're everywhere.
Yeah, we're everywhere, but a lot of people, I think, just have their one little world, and
hmm
those little worlds sometimes develop their own cube philosophy or something. Like there's a mind, was it
hmm
called, groupthink approach it can
Yeah,
develop.
it's one of the reasons that I'm in the 4 major cube discords that I know of, and if I'm not in any of them, and please let me know, because I love popping up in those groups, and even if I don't speak, I read and I read and I read and I read, and I get to learn such unique ideas from all these different cube designers and thinkers. I mean, there are cards in my list that like I would never have come up with on my own, and other people bringing them up, and I go, "Wow, what is this?" Like, I don't know if you've seen in my list the card Chain of Smog. It's this 1 black sorcery from Onslaught. It's target player discards 2 cards from their hand, then they may copy that spell. And this is just one of the best black aggro cards I've ever played with.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that's crazy.
And I would have never found this card on my own, and I'm extremely thankful to all the communities I'm in, because they really help enrich my own cube as well.
Well, anyway, lots of great places to hang out and chat cube with smart people, and get just a huge range of ideas and different cube philosophies. Fleisch, one thing that I really appreciate about your cube philosophy and your cube design broadly is that you are often not entirely content with WotC design decisions, or you want to like modify their design decisions to better fit your own design vision. So you've come up with all kinds of awesome original ideas, some of which I've featured in the videos I've done for Cultic Cube, about how to retool cards to do sort of interesting things with them. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. When I kind of got back into Magic in university, there were a great number of my friends that enjoyed the idea of designing custom cards. Actually, the first cube we had was kind of a community cube of custom cards. Everyone designed X
Huh.
number.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Crazy. Did that
the
work out?
power level, no, not in the slightest. The power level of some of the cards were absolutely through the roof, and other cards were too weak, and some cards were these 4 color cards that were uncastable, and other cards were 18 mana for basically win the game buttons, right? But it really got the creative juices going on how Wizards comes to not only design cards but how they design sets, right? Because every time you put a card into a set or your cube, they're kind of the same for this. You have to think about other cards present in the cube. If I put in, for example, a forked lightning in my cube, or a forked bolt rather, in my cube, I have to think about how many one toughness men do I run? Will it hit all of them? Or do I just only run X2s and then this card, only ever succeeds as a 1-for-1 when its true design is to be a 2-for-1? So, kind of learning that lesson early on how your cards kind of talk to each other in your cube was invaluable to me. That translated deeper on when I was in my current cube iteration, is the third cube I've made. Ixalan came out, and Ixalan was interesting. It was decidingly lower power level, but there were this cycle of enchantments, I believe a few of them were artifacts, that flipped into these powerful lands that often were references to other cards. Itlamok, Cradle of the Sun, flips into a better guy's cradle. Temple of Alikrots, I think, flips
Yeah,
into
Alcazats or
yeah,
something.
a
Yeah.
stronger Diamond Valley, right?
Yeah.
But the front side of these cards were a little sketchy. So,
There's a Tolarian Academy.
oh god, there's a strictly better Tolarian Academy.
Yeah, right. It taps for
It taps
blue.
for a blue, anyways. Yeah, you can
Yeah.
use that on turn one to play your Soul Ring. Easy money.
Yeah.
Um,
Vault of Catlacan or something.
I ended up being unsatisfied that I couldn't run any of these wonderful cards. So I had played. I took a few of them out. I flipped them around and I put them right back in the sleeve. And I played them as these pre-flipped lands. And my playgroup's initial reaction to them was not too hot. A lot of them were afraid that some of these lands would be overpowered, and a few of them truly were. Today, I'm only still running one of them. It's Conqueror's Foothold,
Yes, as am I.
which is the flip side of Conqueror's Galleon. And the card feels great. It's this control linchpin, and it's this amazing ramp card that reads really powerfully but plays very weakly. But at the same time, not so weak that it's unplayable, but not so strong that it's oppressive. And that kind of started me on this path of, what if I started adding a lot of these custom rules? And what if I started adding a lot of these custom cards? And at one point in time, I ran many, many more custom cards in that aspect, but I've also scaled back on that because there's a very notable downside to doing that, and that's taking a solid 10 minutes at the beginning of every draft when you have a new player and being like, hey, so this is how this one card works in the whole 540 cube, and this is how another card works, and now we only run a few custom rules, and that's one of them.
That's a place where the complement of one's playgroup does make a huge difference. There's probably some amount of work you have to do anyway to explain to a new player what the philosophy of your cube is,
I just let them jump in and drown.
Yeah,
No, I'm
fair
kidding.
enough.
Don't do that. Don't do that. And then the other thing that I did was Oath of the Gatewatch came along, and I was sort of pissed about these colorless mana cards, Thought Knot Seers, your Reality Smashers, your Matter Reshapers. In that, I tried to play them. I made my whole land base into these pain lands. I took out my signets or talismans, all these little. I ran Boreal Druid instead of like a Llanowar Elf variant because it made it colorless, right? Before Oath of the Gatewatch, if we'll take the card Thran Dynamo as an example. So Thran Dynamo is an artifact. It's 4 mana to play, and it's a very simple text box of tap, add 3 to your mana pool. So the way that used to work was you just added the 3 to your mana pool. Now it's more properly you add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool. So these Eldrazi cared about having their costs paid, and they had both generic and colorless mana. So you could use any color of mana for that generic mana or colorless mana. But for this specific colorless cost, you had to use only colorless mana, which was a major deck building restriction. Except in modern, but oops.
Yeah, right. Because if you just say a blue-white deck and you've got 10-7 islands and plains or whatever, you And you don't have any mana rocks, there's no way you can cast these cards because you
No,
have to have something that creates colorless mana exactly in order to cast them.
exactly. So Thought Not Seer had a cost of 3 generic and 1 colorless, and it made it. I tried. I really tried. Because I love the cards.
I did
Conceptually,
too.
I love the Eldrazi. They're super weird and they're super neat.
Yeah, and I like that blinking guy a lot. Eldrazi Displacer, I think.
Displacer's the choice one.
Yeah, it's two generic and one
One
colorless
colorless.
mana.
Yeah, to blink a creature on a 3/3 for 2 and a white. But yeah, no, I tried my heart out, and try as I may, it didn't work out. And I took all the cards out, and I have these 2 long boxes of all my old cube rejects that live in their shame box. And then Snowlands came out in Modern Horizons, and I looked at the Snowlands, and I was looking at, I believe it's Icehide Golem, which is a snow mana for a 2/2. And it hit me that this really, really reminded me of the colorless Eldrazi. And I was like, well, I really want to play this guy. I'm going to update all my lands to Snowlands. And then something just clicked, and I went, but what if I just treated all those colorless costs on the Eldrazi as if they were snow? So now all my basic lands can cast these weird cards. And also the colorless mana can do it. And I came up with this list of cards that if I did this, I would run this card, this card, this card, this card. And those were Bearer of Silence, Eldrazi Displacer, Blinding Drone, Matter Reshaper, Spatial Contortion, Thought Not Seer, and Realizer. And I said to myself, if those cards, worked out, then I would try it. And they do. They play great. And I don't think I'll ever go back from it. They play wonderfully. And it's this, if we ever have a return to Eldrazi, which seems sort of unlikely, then I'll be happy to take those cards as well and slam them in my cube under the same rule.
Well, tell me about Eldrazi Displacer and how that card plays. Because when I was trying to make this work, it was in my modern cube, and I had some cute archetypes in there. I supported aristocrats and I supported Blink. And man, I wanted Eldrazi Displacer to work to give me another Blink thing. Because otherwise, the options are pretty slow, There's Venser and Brago and whatever. And this was before Soul Herder.
And Thassa, yeah. So I play Blink. I don't think Blink is necessarily the most powerful thing that you can support, but damn it if it isn't fun to play
It's
with.
fun. Oh yeah, it's fun. I love playing it.
You get to play these like 2 to 3 color greed piles that just are blinking, mere battle spheres for value and so on. And it's an absolute blast. The card has actually additional legs in a more aggressive shell. When you blink a creature with it, so it reads 2 and a colorless, or a snow in my cube. Exile another target creature, then return it to the battlefield tapped.
Oh yeah, interesting. I'd forgotten about that.
I had one of my opponents double activate this and clear out my 2 blockers and just kill me. And I was like, okay, that's fair. You got me, right? Of the colorless cards I run, Bearer of Silence is a 2/1 flyer for 1 and a black, and it has basically kicker for 1 and a colorless. And if you do, your opponent sacks a creature. Blinding Drone is this 1 and a blue for a 1/3. So 1/3s in blue are actually like very deceptively good. Blue's worst matchups are the colors that just play a lot of 2/1s and attack your face. So 1/3s very handily defeat 2/1s, obviously. Survive 2/2s, the standard Grizzly Bear, and then when he isn't able to block, he can actually tap down target creatures. He is a colorless tap target creature, and it plays great. Matter Reshaper is 3/2 for 3, with one of them being colorless. And when he dies, you get to flip the top card of your deck. If it's a permanent that costs 3 or less, it goes into play, and otherwise you draw the card. So it's a very fine roadblock card. Spatial Contortion is very new for me. I actually just added it, and it's a last gasp variant. So it's 1 in a colorless target creature gets +3/-3 until end of turn. So it gets to do double duty as kind of a combat trick and a removal spell. And then lastly, Thought Not Seer that we had talked about and Reality Smasher that we had talked about are just these 2 large good threats. Almost every deck wants them, and the decks that don't want them don't want to play against them.
Yeah, there was a green one, like 7-drop in green, and I think it had reach, possibly.
World Breaker. I tried it. So it was a 5/7 reach for 7, and then when you casted it, you could exile an artifact or enchantment, I think.
Oh,
And then
yeah.
for 2 and a colorless, you could sack a land to return it from your graveyard to your hand. And if it just needed to return to the field, and it would have been great, but it was just always a 7 mana 5/7, which is just not. If it maybe had trample or vigilance or something,
Yeah,
one other,
reach was a real bad keyword on it.
it's not great.
Yeah.
Some other knob needed to be twisted for that card. So I also I tried out Eldrazi Obligator, which is a 3/1 haste for 2 and a red. So it's a 3 mana 3/1 haste, which is nothing to write home about, but plenty playable. And then for 1 and a colorless, when you cast it, you can active treason, gain control of a creature until end of turn, and give it haste. It was just a worse Zealous Conscripts, and Zealous Conscripts wasn't much to write home about in the first place.
Yeah, I remember playing some amount of these cards in Oath of the Gatewatch retail limited, retail draft. Like Spatial Contortion, I remember that being a pretty high pick. It's an uncommon. And that blue tapper, I played a bunch of those guys. I liked that like blue devoid deck.
Especially in that format where you're incentivized to build tall versus building wide. The little tappers were just annoyingly good.
They were for sure. And blue was a cool place to have a tapper.
Mm-hmm.
I love both of those ideas. I'll have to give your Snowland and Colorless Matters thing a whirl. That sounds cool. I'd like to be able to use some of those Eldrazi for sure. And as you say, that a colorless one drop, it's a 2/2. That's
And
excellent,
Ice Hide Golem. Oh, yeah.
right?
I got to run a few snow cards. I'm trying to remember what the other ones were. So I also run Arkham's Astrolabe, a snow mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, so it filters itself, and then for 1 and a tap, you add 1 mana of any color. For those of you thinking that this sounds a lot like a 2 mana artifact that does this exact same thing, Prismatic Lens, it's in a lot of sets. It's just a good card. This is the same good card, but it costs half as much, and that's really nice. And then I get to run On Thin Ice, which is a Journey to Nowhere that chains to a snowland you control for, again, half the cost. And in Simic, I get to run Icefang Coatl, which is a 1/1 flash flying ETB draw card for blue and a green. And then it has Death Touch as long as you have 3 other snow permanents. I play Frostwalk Bastion, which is this really, really good manland if you're snow. It turns into a 2/3 that freezes creatures. It either aggressively pressures as a 2/3, or if you have a large creature come in to attack you, you get to block with this, and it buys you a turn. And then lastly, I run To the North, which is a rampant growth, but cares about snowlands.
I was running that for a while myself, but I errated the card to say basic, and I just made it a functional reprint of Rampant Growth. Yeah, but that was me customizing a card. You go to much more creative lengths, awesome lengths to customize them. And I took your advice as well, about trying the Ixalan flip cards pre-flip, some of them, and that was a lot of fun. I made a video about that, of course. Conqueror's Foothold, I like a lot. That's the only one that I'm running now. And when people look at it, they often think that it's just broken. I'll post pack one, pick ones like on Twitter. And when that comes up in a pack, people will often say that's an slam dunk first pick. You and I have talked about this. I don't think it is a first pick card. I think it's a good mid pack pickup. And it's a fine card to have in one's deck. I love it. So it's tap for colorless. It's 2 and tap to loot. It's 4 and tap to just draw 1. And it's 6 and tap to return target card from your graveyard, or is there a restriction? I don't remember.
Just target card.
Just target card. I never used the 6 and tap mode. I mean,
it's if I can make a recommendation, if you run a cryptic command, it's so much mana, but you just get to tap their board every turn, and it feels great.
that does sound great. That's cool. Anyway, incredibly versatile card. It has uses elsewhere, like for reanimator strategies. It lets you loot for 3 at will, so that's cool. And then it taps for mana. It's great. So anyway, I love the card. I don't think it's actually overpowered, because when you think about it, like 5 mana draw a card, that's cool. I love that I can do that, but also 5 mana draw a card it's expensive.
It's very expensive. And if you recall, when I wrote that, when I was still writing those cube cards of the day so long ago,
Yeah.
About 2 whole paragraphs of the write up are just saying like, no, wait, it's not overpowered. This is an example of what an overpowered card is. Here is a whole video about charting power and card design. And there was this. I tried to get out ahead of it as hard as I could, and I think I did because no one in the comments was like, "Oh, this card's broken." So
Oh, that's great. That's
that
good. You
was
had the foresight to head off that problem at the pass. So, Ben, you're an administrator or mod, an important person in the community and a couple of Cube communities. I mean, many Cube communities, but a few in particular where you have these peacekeeping roles. So, I wonder if you could talk about what challenges there are to maintaining cordial and productive discussions in communities.
one of the larger issues that a lot of cube owners face is something I call the king in the castle syndrome. Most of us cube owners are blessed with also having a cube group. And our cube group kind of listens to what we, the cube owners, says, and can argue, can make points, but at the end of the day, we make our own decisions. It's a lot different when we reach out for help in cubing because when we do, we're reaching out to someone else who has their own castle and runs their own court. You're not reaching out to the person who drafts in another person's cube. You're usually reaching out to another cube owner with a different set of cards, with a different set of everything, right? If you were to talk to a perfect example is I was speaking to someone about a card and they were asking me my input on it. And I said, well, this card looks just too difficult to cast. It was a 3-color card. I don't think I'll ever be casting this card. And they said, well, actually, my cube is only those 3 colors. And I said, oh, well, that's wonderful. Thank you for letting me know
Right.
that, right? And it's an issue of a lot of the time people don't communicate their wants well, and then when they receive advice telling them to either cut a card that they have an emotional connection to or to cut a card that they are just testing for the first time or cut a card that they just personally like playing with. Like, I'm no different. I play cards in my list that I know actively aren't good, but I play them anyways because someone in my play group likes them or any number of those reasons. But then when I ask for advice, if, for example, I'm going to use the card Citadel Siege. Citadel Siege was an amazing card in its Fate Reforged limited format. It was 2 white. When it entered, you chose one of 2 modes. The first mode, putting 2/1/1 counters on a creature at the beginning of combat on your turn, and the other mode at the beginning of combat on each of your opponent's turns, tapping one of their creatures, which was usually their best creature. This card played incredible offense, and it played incredible defense. But in Cube, a lot of the time at 4 mana, it comes down a little too late or it doesn't do enough. So this card was incredible. I ported it over to my Cube. It plays very decently in my Cube. I know that there are cards that I can run in my white section that are better than this, but I choose not to because both I and my playgroup enjoy this card.
Yeah.
That means when I ask for advice for my cube and I go, hey, John, take a look at my cube. Which card do you think is the weakest? You come across a card like Citadel Siege. You don't know the story behind it. You don't know why I'm playing this card. And you just say, wow, that kind of looks like not a great card. Why are you playing this? I have an emotional response because this is a card that I enjoy playing with. This is a card that my players enjoy playing with.
Yeah.
And I tell you off.
Yeah. Right.
This happens almost every day on the
I
subreddit.
sort of doubt that you're going to tell me off, but somebody might tell me off.
But this happens all the time because folks aren't communicating what they want, and other folks can necessarily be tone deaf. So a lot of the time, there's no actual. You have to gauge the intent, and 98 out of 100 times, there's no malicious intent. Absolutely none.
Yeah.
It's just someone not understanding what one person wanted and coming across as a different way. Most of the time, it's just a matter of getting people on the same page. It's important for you to approach constructive criticism and constructive cube design as a designer and just look at the cards as cards. So you don't come across as either tone deaf or you don't step on anyone's toes, depending on which side of the question you're on.
Yeah. And one wants to make something of one's format clear when one's asking for advice, make something of one's design goals clear. I mean, that's probably the most important thing, really. So you still may not be able to capture everything, like the fact that you're not going to go through a list of cards that are particularly meaningful to you, probably. But you could say that you do value nostalgia in design, right? So there are some cards that you're not going to let go of.
Yes, some people run museum cubes.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one of my favorite Magic cards of all time is Spirit Monger. I played it at my cube well past its time until finally it was too awful for, and I had to cut it. But every time I someone gave me advice for my cube, they were like, "But why?" And I was like, "Nostalgia." Like, and I was running a bit of what's commonly called a museum cube, where it was, powerful cards from Magic's history versus necessarily wanting to curate a powerful limited environment.
I totally understand doing that. Lots of us do cube in order to continue playing cards that we've got some emotional connection to. I certainly do that as well. I've got Sorin Lord of Innistrad. I just recall an awesome draft where, my first pack I opened Sorin Lord of Innistrad and I just like ran the room. Man, love the card. And he's here he is, still in the cube.
I love that emblem. I think if he started at 4 loyalty, legitimately, he'd be a very powerful option. Just being able to go emblem. But
That's very true.
I love the card. I used to play him as well back when.
So, hey, you were telling me about this theory of cube in relation to board games. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So for anyone who's played Arkham Horror, one of my favorite things about the game is that you get to set a different level of difficulty, depending on which ancient one you want to fight. So Arkham Horror uses a lot of the eldritch monstrosities of Lovecraft. So you get to choose which monstrosity you fight. For example, like if you fight Yogg Sothoth, he's going to probably beat the crap out of you because he's very difficult to fight. Whereas if you fight a Zazoth, it's a much easier thing, right? It's a very binary. You either do the mission or you don't. There's a fail state and a success, and nowhere in the middle. I find a lot of people treat their cube as a Magic format, where more accurately, it's kind of like a board game. I bring my cube out to board game nights that I do with one of my friend groups, and occasionally we'll play it. But if you think about it in terms of being a board game, all these custom rules, all these little modifications you make, like, have you ever been a diehard Monopoly player and gone to a friend's house and played Monopoly for the first time, and they've got all these house rules, and you're just like, I don't think these are right. People don't do that with Magic, but maybe they should.
Yeah, that's true. It seems like in early days of Magic, maybe it was this Wild West where there were no unified rules or there was different language throughout the rules. And
Then screw it. Why don't you make your own content? Why don't you make your own custom
yeah,
cards? The cube is your oyster. You get to do anything with it you want because it's your cube. I'm a huge fan of kind of treating your cube as if it's another board game in your collection, just obviously one that you need to be much more careful with.
yes.
depending on your cube. It's one of the few board games you also have all of your power over, right? I'm loath to admit this if Sam, you ever listen to this, but in my cube, I used to run Days, and I got absolutely wrecked by a Days 2 games in a row, and I lost the set. And I went, okay, Days is gone. I killed Days as my emotional response. And I've never admitted.
Yeah. Oh no.
But it's this level you have, like if you're playing Monopoly, it's not like you can just like take a knife and cut out Boardwalk from
Right.
if you're playing
No
Risk.
more jail.
Yeah, right.
Free all the prisoners.
If you're playing Risk, you can't just like pretend that like Australia doesn't exist, right? But yeah, with your cube, you can just get away with anything as long as you're the curator. So
It's great not to be too hidebound by expectations of what cube is.
Mhm.
You're talking about not allowing yourself to be restricted by WotC and by magic design, for
Exactly.
instance. That's awesome.
Mhm.
And I think that people can bend some of those rules about expectations of what cube is as well. People typically think of cube as a singleton format. It doesn't have to be, though.
One of my favorite fellow members of the Cube community, Sir Funchalot, plays, I believe, 2 fetches and 3 duels.
Right. 3 ABUR duels.
Yeah, of all 10 colors. And his reasoning makes sense. Why run these strictly worse duels that randomly punish my players by either having them lose life or come into play tap? And this is the Shocklands I'm talking about. When I could just instead run a bunch of duels and fetches. And it plays wonderfully for him. In my own vintage cube, I do that as well.
Yeah, I run double fetches. I don't go quite that deep, but I've done that for, I don't know, maybe 3 years now, and I just love double fetches, and I proselytize for them constantly.
In my primary cube, I stay 1 for 1, but in my vintage cube, man, I run 2 of each mox in my vintage cube. So
That's cool. You're doing some real broken stuff.
you know what? Though the best part of playing vintage cube is playing with the broken powered cards that you never get to play with. And
Yeah.
the worst part of vintage cube is when other people are dominating you with those same cards because you didn't get any. So what this kind of just ensures that everyone has a little bit more of a wacky power deck running around.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That's a reason too why I think vintage cubes, powered cubes, are best at 360 usually, unless you're breaking singleton as you're describing. Maybe it doesn't matter so much, but you want to increase the density of those sweet, sweet cards everybody wants to play with.
Exactly. Stretching out your cards too high means that someone opens a Soul Ring and someone else opens Fire Diamond. Like
Hmm.
these two cards are not on the same level. So
Yeah, that's true. So tell me, who's been in a tweet?
that's 144 or however many characters or less.
Yeah, I think they doubled it, maybe.
That's a lot.
So maybe it's 280 or something.
Ooh,
Anyway, oh, yeah. You can write a whole novel in 280 characters.
wowie,
So
wowie.
what's the novel that is Ben?
Well, I'm Canadian. I love bad music. I love good food. I love cooking good food while listening to bad music. Magic's my favorite game. I view myself as pretty laid back and just open to have a conversation with anyone about anything. So
Ben is good people. I've had a relationship with you now on the Discords for, I don't know, a couple
we
years, I guess.
started on Reddit. I remember talking to you on a few threads way, 3 or 4 years ago now.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so earlier you were spouting some heresy over text, whereby you were claiming that Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek in the history of ever.
This is
That
true.
seems like a patently false assertion and clearly a classic Trek. The
Do you know what my favorite part is? Now I just get to cut up your audio and just get this
Mhm.
nice little clip that just says Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek.
Right. Oh no, this has all in fact been a long con to get me to say that Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek. Yeah. No, classic. I'm a classic Trekker all the way. What's your argument for Deep Space Nine?
Okay, I got a few arguments for Deep Space Nine. The first is the world around us. Serial television just doesn't hold up anymore. One of my biggest issues with Voyager was that you could have an episode of Voyager where like someone gets their like brain removed and like another person like goes through this like lives like 2 lifetimes as an alien prison slave, and then the third arc could be like Tuvok killed a man and needs to figure out how that changes his life, right? And then by the next episode, all the characters were the same. TNG suffers from the same thing, but at least the characters change in TNG. Deep Space Nine gets the best of both worlds, where Deep Space Nine is by nature it's a show on a space station, the eponymous Deep Space Nine. So you get these repeating characters that traders that come to the station. The villains are for the most part the Cardassians who are in close proximity to Deep Space Nine. So you get the same few Cardassian gulls or captains that come by. Deep Space Nine has these events that take place that change characters fundamentally, and they stay true to their actions. Cisco goes from this, depressed, wanting to quit Starfleet commander to, a prophet of these aliens that he cares nothing for, to a impassioned commander, to a military leader, right? To this guy that'll do anything to win it and actually engages in some pretty sneaky and underhanded stuff, right? And at the time, in the mid 90s, he was the single black father who was raising his son, right? Which is just the wonderful message to give, especially in sci fi. But Deep Space Nine gets to do this thing where, like, the characters, because they're in this one place, not only do the characters get to grow together, but the area around them gets to grow. Deep Space Nine itself changes from the set, they change it up from season 1, 2, 3, 4.
For me, the ratings go Classic Trek, the original series on top, and then Next Gen I like quite a bit, and then Deep Space Nine, and then, I don't know, everything else. I'm a Classic Trekker all the way. It founds the universe and does so in really interesting ways. I like the characters and the interpersonal relationships that they have, or the sort of chemistry that develops between the main bridge characters.
I like the big three in the original series for the reason of Spock, Kirk, and McCoy, obviously, and how they pick at each other.
I read a ton of the novels growing up. So the thing is, this has hugely colored my impression of the series. Of that, I am certain. I read hundreds of these novels, or I don't know how many. And these, of course, are developing the relationships between the characters in a much more robust way. A consequence of that is going back and watching the series, I feel as if I can sort of read more into these relationships than
Then perhaps what's there, yeah.
than might really exist. Yeah, exactly.
I do that a lot in TNG. We were a big family for going to book fairs and book sales, and often the Star Trek books kind of just sat around as like these $1 books, and I was a big reader as a kid.
Right. There were a bunch of technical manuals and that kind of thing. I loved those too.
I love reading about the ships and all this various, like this one's warp core can do this much stuff, and this one's warp core can do this much stuff.
Yeah, I had a bunch of these weird one-off ones too that I would go to Star Trek festivals when I was young. There would be lots of vendors there, and there would be people who were selling zines and who were selling these self-published books, which would often just be like literally photocopied or mimeographed or something, produced and bound themselves. I had a ton of those as well that would get into more esoteric subjects, or they'd be about Romulan ships of classic Trek or something, and maybe be making up ships. Anyway, those were so much fun. I love those things. Deep Space Nine, I like. I think the characters are really interesting and compelling. I don't love the fact that they're bound to the space station because that seems sort of un-Trek to me, where I want to be in a starship going hither and thither, exploring
I
strange new worlds.
100% agree with that. I think the advent of the wormhole and the gamma quadrant is like a good way of going about that.
Yeah, and they introduced the Defiant at some point and made that a somewhat regular mode of transportation. Well, Ben, what's a common myth about Cube, and why do you think that myth endures?
I'd say there are three common. Can I do three?
Yeah, do three.
I'll do three. So there's three. The first is that cube has to be an expensive format. The second is that cube has to be a complicated format. And the third is that cube is meant to be the quote unquote the best cards in Magic. So we'll go first with the expensive one. I have to give a shout out to Brad and Eric of Solely Singleton. They did a wonderful job putting together the board game cube. If you're ever looking to build a cube, that is the perfect place that I think to start.
And the conceit here was that they gave themselves a budget of $100 to construct a, I don't know, 360 card cube, I
So
suppose.
it comes out to 36 cents a card.
Yeah. And it's not really rarity restricted. It's not like it's a pauper cube.
It's a good cube, and it's $100. So the first myth of cube having to be expensive, zilch, doesn't add up, doesn't work.
Yeah, and also let me just add that when I began my cube, I took boxes of draft chaff and, random cards I had lying around, and that's what I built a cube out of. I spread cards out all around me in the living room and started sorting them, and eventually I got 360 cards together. And the cube wasn't great, but it was super fun, and it was a fine place to start, and it cost me nothing. I mean, it cost me something in the past, but I had all these cards.
The second is that cubes have to be complicated. Cubes don't have to be complicated. To look further on that, I would actually recommend looking at any of the Modern Masters sets. A lot of those play as miniaturized cubes. They've got a higher than average power set, and there's synergies kind of baked into the commons and uncommons, where every card was put there deliberately versus having to fill a constructed need or having to fill a flavor card or whatever. Those master sets are generally pretty low complexity and play very nicely. One of the hardest things to wrap your head around in cube is like you can have these cards that have escape, and next to it there's a card with cascade, and next to it there's a card with unearth, and next to that there's a card with like hostage taking from Frogkin kidnapper or whatever, ransom. There we go. And
Ransom, that's
that's
right.
four mechanics that just don't pop up anywhere. But in Cube, you'll find every single one of them. It's a high barrier to entry in terms of complexity, but that doesn't have to be the case. Your format's only ever going to be as complicated as you want it to be as the cube owner. And if you're finding your players are having issues either not taking certain powerful cards because they don't understand them, and that's certainly reasonable. There are some very powerful cards with very strange wordings. If you look at a card like Limdol's Vault or a card like Territorial Hellkite, those cards read like a novel for a very simple effect.
Yeah, that can be off-putting for people.
Exactly. If you find your players are often not taking these powerful cards, that may be because they don't necessarily understand, or they don't necessarily, the complexity of cards is too high in the cube. And sometimes smoothing that out and gradually building up your players, especially if you're a newer player group, is a really good idea.
I have a friend who made a cube that is, I think it was core set mechanics only cube. So it was mainly evergreen mechanics, but you can imagine it's got, I don't know, Convoke and whatever else has appeared in core sets sometimes. But that's awesome. It's a fine introductory cube for somebody who's maybe new to cube, but knows their way around Magic. But also, it had enough complexity that it was a lot of fun to play, even for very experienced cubers, I think. So there are definitely ways of limiting complexity, and that can be a real advantage, as you're describing.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, the final myth that I wanted to touch is that your cube has to always contain the best cards in Magic. I hear that from people all the time. Why aren't you playing Black Lotus? Why aren't you playing the Moxen? Why aren't you playing Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, etc.?
Uh huh.
Tinker, so on. Your cube is whatever you want it to be. I curate a power level that I generally want games to end between turns 4 and 7, or rather, I want games to be decided by turns 4 or 7. Sometimes they go a few turns longer. I don't want people to randomly lose the game on turn 2 because their opponent happened to go Faithless Looting into Animate Dead Griselbrand and win. Because of that, I don't support those strategies. I don't run cheap reanimation. I don't run show and tells and effects like that cheat in from your hand at early CMCs. I run things like Sneak Attack and Ilarg because they're both 4+1 mana and 5 mana respectively.
Yeah, those are good cards. And do you run Natural Order? Or is that too broken?
I find Natural Order is just a little too much because at least with Ilarg and Sneak Attack, you have to assemble in your hand. With Natural Order, it's just grab it from the deck.
It tutors it up.
And I stay away from those more, channel balance, those cards like that, because while they're certainly powerful and I personally enjoy playing with them, I find that unless I'm upping my whole cube to that power level, then only updating parts of the cube kind of leaves me in a strange place where one person's pack one pick one is stronger than another person's whole pack one, right? All 15 cards from it.
Yeah.
And I never want that to be a thing. I never want someone to feel like they lost a game because their opponent just had better cards than them.
You want the cube to be operating within some power band, some recognizable power band. And it may be a wide power band, but you probably don't want insane spikes or insane valleys, right? With respect to the general power level of the cube.
If the biggest threat in your cube is, say, an Artisan of Kozilek, maybe don't run Channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if you're running, a whole powered cube, run that Channel. Channel out that Emrakul, win that game. But don't support those cards in a cube that doesn't have a surrounding power level that boasts a similar strength.
And a lot of expensive cards, of course, have analogs that might be a little worse, but that are much more affordable. Like Mana Drain, you probably shouldn't be running unless you're really quite high power level anyway. But Counterspell.
That's a tangent I really want to go on, actually.
Tell me about Mana Drain.
Not specifically Mana Drain. One of the things that frustrates me with a lot of people's design approaches is that just because a card is strictly worse, it does not mean it's not worth playing. So there's Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt is a single red mana. Instant, deal 3 to a creature. It's so ubiquitous in Magic that it's used as terminology. And it's a wonderfully powerful card. You'll find that most cubes are also running Searing Spear. It's double the mana as Lightning Bolt for the same card. I personally am running Fire Ambush, which is Searing Spear, but at sorcery speed. So it's worse in, it's double the cost of Lightning Bolt and only on sorcery speed for Fire Ambush.
Yeah. It's an incendiary flow.
Does that make the card look horrible? Yeah, it really does. Is the card horrible? No, it's really not. And looking at these, cards like I'm running Endless One right now.
Mm.
Endless One is not strictly worse because it's not an artifact, but it's usually worse than Stone Coil Serpent. Run them both. They're both good, right? I find a lot of people's card evaluation turns off once they've kind of just decided that the card is, because it's strictly worse, it's not worth playing. Don't be like that. Don't make that decision.
Hmm.
Is Llanowar Elves worse than Noble Hierarch? Yeah, Noble Hierarch's not strictly better. It's got 0 power versus 1 power, but Noble Hierarch's going to be better larger percentage of the time. But do you see people not run Llanowar Elves as a result? No.
No. And I mean, you mentioned Boreal Druid earlier. I run Boreal Druid, and that's definitely worse than Llanowar Elves. It
Hell
taps
yeah.
for colorless.
Hey man, it is a snow creature, that might come.
Yeah, well, yeah, in your cube, it's totally different, I suppose, in your cube. But in my cube,
No,
it's
it's
an
mostly the
elf who
same.
taps for colorless. Yeah,
Yeah. No, and it's this totally fine creature, right?
it is. It's still a good card. It's still 1 mana acceleration. That's great.
But people look at Boreal Druid and they go, "Oh, but it's not as good as that thing." And what I really want to hammer home is, so what?
Yeah.
It's important to play a certain density of good cards. I have a good friend named Zach, and Zach was putting together a commander cube. Zach is a old Magic player. He's been playing longer than I have by a great amount of time, and he's got a very extensive collection. Zach likes these strange eclectic cards that have been printed over the years. So in his commander cube, he put in a lot of these, and they're these cards that are very, very powerful in situations that don't always arise. What I really pushed at him to do was to cut the more narrow cards for, this narrow card might be, a 10 out of 10 card in this one narrow time, but at all other times it's a 2 out of 10 card. Let's not run that. Let's run this generic good that's always, a 6 or 7 out of 10 that we're always happy to. And, these cards like Boreal Druid, Fire Ambush, they do just that. Instead of having to play these, narrow cards that maybe just aren't that good, we get to play more of the same effect to make sure that the average card of our cube, like the average strength of our cube, rises versus, spikes or valleys.
Yeah. Some people might object that they want more unique effects in their cube. And if that's important to your design, then that makes perfect sense. That's totally what you should do, of course.
Mm-hmm.
With things like elves, it's a little bit harder, just in the sense that I think that obviously, you need some density of elves in order to get the number that you want to see at the table, depending on how large the cube is and how many people you're drafting with. These are questions that can be answered with hypergeometric analysis. I did a thing on that.
I never actually learned how to do those. I just made other
Well,
people do them for me.
do I have the video for you then, friend?
I've been outed as not having watched every one of your videos.
Yeah. That one features Pixels, whom you'll know from the Discord, and Land of Mordor, whom you'll know from Reddit.
Oh, I'm a big fan of Land of Mordor. He and I talk about Star Wars all the time.
Oh, yeah, that's good. He's good people.
Yeah, I like him.
What was I saying? Anyway, you need some number of elves. Like, you want some number of lightning bolt variants, probably. And I run Fire Ambush as well. This is some signature Sir Fungelot tech.
Bless him for it, too. I never knew the card.
Yeah, bless him for it. Yeah, for sure. Anyway, I'm right there with you, but I can see how somebody might want fewer burn spells and more. I don't know. You mentioned Citadel Siege. Wasn't there a red siege that? Oh, Outpost.
Yeah.
Outpost Siege. Yeah, right. You want Outpost Siege? Go for it, and don't run Fire Ambush. That sounds great too.
For those people, I do stress: make sure your cube has some generically good cards. Just so your average drafter who comes along and has decent card evaluation can go, oh, this card is good, this card is good, this card is good. I don't know what archetypes they're doing, but I can put together this decent deck just off having skill from limited formats, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So what advice would you give to somebody who comes up to you and is like, hey, Fleisch, I want to build a cube. What do I do?
I would honestly recommend starting with solely Singleton's board game cube and moving from there. I would go through that cube, and you can start adding the cards that you like more. For example, if you're really a big fan of a certain planeswalker, like let's say Elspeth Knight Errant, and in that cube they're running some token maker at 5 mana. That might be an appropriate cut to make. And over time, start upgrading the cube. You don't necessarily have to increase the power level, but upgrade the cube in a way that hopefully and still helpfully contributes to how your cube synergizes with itself.
Yeah, and makes it a more unique cube. Put your own fingerprints on the thing.
I would also stress running, at least initially with your cube, running more generically good cards versus more powerful hit or miss narrow cards. I find cards that hate out a certain color to be just not worth running in cube.
Yeah,
Because while they're very powerful, let's say if it hits red or green cards 2/5 of the time, 5 colors in Magic, those 3/5 of the time, having it in your game one deck or having to keep it in your sideboard is just not worth doing, and it can make a bad play experience for your opponent.
yeah. That's one of the reasons why I really don't love the swords of X and Y. I don't like the protection mechanic. I don't like Mirren Crusader. Not that, I mean, I guess people still run Mirren Crusader. But anyway, I've never liked that card, darn it, because sometimes you just play against a green black deck and that's that.
That's actually exactly when I cut my Mirren Crusader, when someone played it against me, and I had a hand of like Go for the Throat, Abrupt Decay, and one other removal spell, and I went, "Ha! I guess I'm dead." Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
no, I avoid protection. I avoid land walk. I think I run 2 protection from multicolor cards in my cube, and then I run both Giver and Mother of Runes as well.
Yeah. I like that Sword of Dungeons and Dragons though. That's the only sort of X and Y I do run. It's a silver bordered card, and it gives +2/+2 like the other swords. And when it connects with the player, you make a 4/4 dragon, flying dragon. Oh, and it's a gold dragon, I think, which is cute because D&D. And then there's some nonsense about rolling a d20, and if you get a critical hit, you get to make another dragon or something. But
That 5% of
yeah,
the
yeah, that's not bad. That just annoyed me and my friends. So we decided we were just going to ignore the roll in a d20 thing and say it makes a dragon. And that's cool.
I do really like that it gives protections from rogues and clerics. That's super.
Yeah. Yeah, because that could have mattered, right? They could have given it protection from wizards and soldiers or something. Well, I guess
Either
soldiers doesn't
rogue
make
or
sense.
cleric is a very common type.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It doesn't really come up. At least I pray it doesn't, because honestly, I'm not sure I'm looking for it very reliably since I feel like it never
oh, you
comes up.
do run Brazen Borer. That's a rogue.
That's true.
Oh, Giver of Runes is a cleric. Uh-oh. You want to talk about your favorite cube or magic memory? I've got a spicy one.
You got one? Okay. Well, yeah. What's your favorite cube memory?
It's not cube. It's original or it's Modern Masters Draft. The
Okay.
one with the Spirit Dragons from Kamigawa at Mythic Rare, I should add. So I've got my opponent's got me down to about 9 life, but I've stabilized. They've got a Jugan the Rising Star, which is this green legendary dragon spirit. He's a 6 mana, 3 green, green, green. He's a 5/5 flyer, and when he dies, you distribute 5/1/1 counters among any number of targets.
That's right. Because I remember Kakusho and whatever, but I didn't remember the green one.
No one ever does.
No.
But he's actually quite good and limited. So I attack my opponent down. They block a thing with Jugan. I get them down to 3. I've got lethal on board. My opponent goes untap, upkeep, draw, looks me dead in the eyes and goes, ha ha ha, ha, and starts laughing. And I go, and they play a second Jugan the Rising Star. They legend rule to keep the original. So the second Jugan dies, putting 5/1/1 counters on the original. And they swing for 10 in the air and kill me.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
I looked at them just like my mouth was agape, and I was just like, really? And you can't be mad about something like that.
No, that's cool. That's one in a who knows how many
they,
thousands chance
they
that
got
they,
2 Jugans in their draft, and they
yeah.
got to absolutely destroy me with them.
Yeah. That's cool. Let's see. Favorite cube memory. This isn't a game, but there was a time when I was cubing with friends, and I had pulled out a nice bottle of rye. I don't even remember what the rye was. I guess it's immaterial, but it was a good bottle of rye, darn it. And I didn't have a strict enough policy about drinks on the table. So not only were drinks on the table, but in fact, an entire bottle of rye was on the table.
Oh no.
And of course, disaster struck. And this was before we'd started playing, but people were helping me shuffle the cube and make packs and things. Oh man. Anyway, I lost a lot of cards and I was super bummed about it.
The lesson here is always double sleeve.
Oh, he always double sleeve. That's totally the lesson. It was, yep, I had single sleeve those cards, and that was a bad mistake. And then I was so paranoid about the problem after that I triple sleeved, maybe not all of the cube, but at least some of it. And I was putting perfect fit over perfect fit, and then the outer sleeve, it was a mess. And the cards were like warping. It was just a bad idea. Lesson number 2 to take from this: do not triple sleeve. The double, that's all you need.
So when you started cubing, were you reading any articles or were you just kind of winging it?
Well, I was reading articles pretty early on, maybe not in the earliest days when I just started messing around, but I was reading articles by our friend Usman Jamil. I read a lot of his stuff. He was writing for Star City Games in the past, and then Quiet Speculation and Cool Stuff Inc. So he was definitely an influence. Also, I was reading a lot of articles by Jason Waddell as well on Channel Fireball. And I was frequenting some forums and that kind of thing, although I wasn't super involved in the communities then. I was mainly just absorbing information, as I'm sure a lot of people do, which is great. In the past few years, or I don't know, 3 or 4 years, I've gotten much more involved in different communities, and that's been hugely helpful to me and rewarding. A lot of fun. Have met lots of awesome people. How about you? Were you consuming content when you got started?
Fortunately, in my home city of Winnipeg, there exists another Cube podcast, Cubism, if you've ever heard of them.
Yeah.
Cube wasn't a entirely foreign or alien concept where I lived and at all of my LGSs. So although I didn't really read anything that had to do with Cube, I learned Cube by osmosis. Um, by just being around other cube players or people who have cubed, I started developing my own opinions, etc. And like you, I found Usman's articles. This is far before I ever had the pleasure of actually getting to know him and learning all about his cats. Uh,
Yeah.
but I found his articles and would read them, and I would learn different style of card evaluations. And at the time, I didn't cube. I actually used Usman's articles to learn limited pretty well. He would talk about how cards translated well into cube, and cube is kind of this. It's kind of a bastard child of limited and constructed, right? And it's this place where you're not entirely constructed, but you're definitely not entirely limited. So a lot of because I was a very large limited player at the time, um, a lot of his reviews being for Cube would also still be relevant for me,
No,
and I
that's
found him to
interesting.
be a good writer, and to
Yeah.
make he still is. Obviously, we should get Usman a preview card.
Yeah, for sure we should.
But no, and I learned an absolute ton about how to evaluate cards, and then eventually I made my own cube. I read pretty much exclusively his content, and someone introduced me to the dark pit of the internet that is Reddit. And after a while, I found the Magic subreddit. After a while, I found the Cube subreddit, and my cubes have just gotten stronger since.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Ben. It's been a pleasure talking to you and an honor having you on the podcast. So thanks.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me, and can't wait to listen to more of this podcast once you get it all out there.